Let's play a game. Say you could go back in time to any civilization and live there long term. Which one do you choose? My answer, without really too much consideration, is the Indus River Valley civilization, or as it is kind of more commonly known now, the Harappan civilization. Why? It had plumbing, buried sewer systems. You could walk in the street and there wouldn't be feces. Oh my gosh, there were toilets. There were toilets in most of the houses. Talk about innovation. Now, I'm good for a short-term camping trip in a remote area. That's fine. But if we're talking long-term, or if we're talking urban, meaning lots of people, I'm all about me some good plumbing. So there's no chance you're getting me to Sumer. There's no chance you're getting me to Edinburgh, really, when it was called Old Reekie. We're talking about urban environments where there are lots of people, and with that comes lots of stool. The Harappans really take the cake when it comes to sanitization. But I'm skipping ahead by a lot. This is the mature Harappans that I'm talking about right now, and there's a whole heck of a lot of history in between the mature civilization and how they got there in the first place, which is a large part of this video. So, much like a preacher's sermon, this is coming to you in 3 parts that is kind of disguised as 4 parts. So part 1 is going to be introduction, which we're sort of already doing. Part 2 is going to be early humans that transition into early Harappan civilization. Part 3, the Harappans. Part 4, decline and overall impact. So here we go, intro. When does India's history begin? Or more accurately, when does history transfer from prehistory into historical record? And that's a pretty complicated question. We have written records of seals and tablets from the Harappan or Indus River Valley civilization that thrived and lived between 2600 BC and to about 1900 BC before the language was lost. And history typically begins when we start having handwriting. So, history. Problem. Historians and archaeologists have yet to interpret the script, meaning that we don't know what any of these seals say, which throws us back into prehistory. But there are records of the Harappans from the Mesopotamians. So, written records that bring them up, history. So I would personally say that the Harappans exist in what should be declared as history, but we run into some problems where linguists, geneticists, and archaeologists have had to treat the Harappans like a prehistoric civilization. Maybe one day that'll change, but for now, that's where it lands. And with this history versus prehistory talk kind of comes this tension that is pretty common in Indian history in general, which is where does Indian culture itself originate and how much of it is influenced by the West or the East? More specifically, the West. There were a lot of attempts, specifically under British rule, to parallel a lot of what happened in ancient Indian history with the same achievements that occurred in the West. Which means that when the Harappan civilization was rediscovered in 1820, there was a real temptation to start saying that these were agricultural settlements that were planted from Mesopotamia. Even some of their myths, like the Indian flood myth, have led to some conclusions that these are all related, a shared myth history, if you will, that comes from Mesopotamia or Egypt and made its way over to India. But India probably has more experience than any other location in the world for handling huge floods, i.e. monsoons. So this notoriously errant river system had caused plenty of flooding in the past. I would say that more likely than the flood myth coming from Mesopotamia, instead we just have a shared situation where there were 2 major civilizations that often dealt with flooding and that impacted, potentially, their religious practices. While the Harappans, we don't really know what their religious practices were because we don't have a record of them yet that we can read, the flood myth did potentially persist and did potentially originate with the Harappans and made its way continually into Indian mythology and history. What does all of that mean? It means that while there has been a tendency in the past to try and parallel the West and India, now within the Indian historiography, there's more of a temptation to try and say that India had very little influence from the West. And that's not really true either. The middle ground that makes the most sense, and what I hope the linguistics that we're going to be referencing here in this video make clear, India is a melting pot of migrants. There is a very strong base of first Indian DNA within the entire subcontinent's genetics. And the first Indians are the peoples who arrived in India about 40,000 BC. But there have been migrations throughout India's history that have brought in new genetics, and with it, new languages, new religions, and new ways of life. What is so distinctive about India and these migrations is how they blended with that early population very early on, and then with the introduction of the caste system, somewhat genetically froze. And the caste system is something we are not covering today. That is a classical India video, which we're not getting that far. But the point being, because of the lack of historical written record until about 500 CE, historians have been limited to analyzing genetics to track historical groups' movements. They have been limited to speculating over linguistic changes and relations and being really into very small changes in pottery because that's what we've got. What comes together from a prehistorical standpoint is a very rich and interesting civilization that was obsessed with standardization, that probably didn't fight any major wars over a 700-year period, and that was really interested in pursuing trade far abroad. At first called the Indus River Valley because the majority of sites were found in the Indus River Valley. It is now referred to as the Harappan civilization based on the first city that was discovered, Harappa. This is because the range of the Harappan civilization is really big. So we're going to be in northern India, we're going to be scooching over into modern-day Pakistan, up into Afghanistan, and a little bit into Iran. Harappan finds have included buildings, tools, artifacts, jewelry, and some sculpture. Maritime trades with the Sumerians have been attested to by the Sumerians and left some interesting finds out in Mesopotamia also. There have not been archaeological finds that we would consider today really kind of like the flashy cool ones. So we don't have pyramids, we don't have ziggurats, we don't have giant towers, we don't have hinges. And if there is a lack of eye-catching architecture, this isn't because the civilization was unable. It really has more to do with the fact that they just didn't have the resources available. Stone was pretty scarce. Timber wasn't necessarily very mature or tall. So a lot of the wood was used for firing kilns to make bricks. And these bricks, chef's kiss, some of the most impressive bricks of the ancient world. The bricks had to be kept very small for good firing, which limited how tall you could make something. So it's very rare to have something over, say, 2 stories in a Harappan city. But the bricks, really. Archaeologists at first thought they were so good that they could not come from an ancient civilization. Like, talk about a compliment to these ancient masons. With these bricks and a bunch of other things that we'll cover, standardization was what ruled in the Harappan civilization. The bricks were of standard dimensions. The stone cubes that they used for weights and measurements standardized across the entire region. The roads and thoroughfares and cities had really specific dimensions that they had to keep to. So say a street was going to be twice as wide as kind of a cutout alley, and then a main thoroughfare is going to be 2 to 1.5 times larger than a street. Cities were laid out on a plan, so they're north, south, east, west plan systems. They are legitimately the first planned cities in the ancient world. The Harappans were able to slice, scrape, bevel, and bore using a standard set of tools. Their tools were made out of chert, copper, and bronze. They fashioned all sorts of tools and arts and crafts, such as knives, sickles, bangles, fish hooks, arrowheads, saws, chisels. So how did they do it? How did the Harappan civilization develop? So when we talk about the Harappan civilization as something Indian within the Indus River Valley, and then you look at a map and see kind of the range that is existing here, you're going to notice that it's in northern India. It is right next to Pakistan, and also it is including a lot of area that is in Pakistan and Afghanistan. So is it totally an Indian civilization, or should we be viewing this as also Pakistani? And I and most archaeologists would argue no, but let me tell you why. Because you may not know this. In 1947, India was undergoing a transition to a non-colonized country, which meant England was being told to get out. For starters, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and India were all separated from each other in 1947, and then in 1971, Bangladesh separated from Pakistan. So 1947, you're going to have the partition of India, and that's going to be where the Muslim League was demanding, as India moved towards independence as a colonial state, that there should be a Muslim state that was all to itself, of modern-day Pakistan and Bangladesh as 2 Muslim states. So there was a required migration. All the Muslims in India had to move to Pakistan and Bangladesh, and then all the non-Muslims had to get out of Pakistan and Bangladesh and move into India proper. For that reason, the modern-day faith and even genetic makeup of Pakistan and Bangladesh is not representative of who lived there at the time of the Harappan civilization, or even the people who lived there 2,000 years ago. While these areas were majority Muslim at the time, Muslims used to live all over India, and non-Muslims used to live in modern-day Pakistan. So if we go in the way back machine to the Harappan civilization and look at the genetic makeup of those people, a large portion of their genetics would be from the group considered to be the first Indians, which is the first Homo sapiens who came to India and left genetically successful offspring. They arrived there in about 40,000 BC. So the Harappans are Indian, and we should consider genetically them as Indian. It is an Indian civilization. The first Indians used microlithic technology, and their population dramatically increased in central and eastern India. At the time of their arrival, around 40,000 BC, there were still plenty of other archaic humans wandering around. So we know Homo erectus, but there were probably some other ones that we have not necessarily genetically identified and named. And these archaic humans had been in the subcontinent for a long time, hundreds of thousands of years. They were very well established. So what these first Indian migrants had to do was they had to take different routes from where those Homo erectus populations were heavily concentrated, because then they would be fighting for resources with Homo erectus. Homo erectus was better established. They would have gotten killed. So the first Indians moved across northern India from a west to east pattern, and from north to south, trying to kind of stay on the coastline. And then about 35,000 years ago or so, we have kind of that major environmental change that started to occur that turned into the Ice Age. And then during the Ice Age, Homo sapien, we got to say it, they rocked it. They did so good. They outlived, outlasted, and outsurvived all of those other archaic humans, so that at the end of the Ice Age, say 12,000 years ago, Homo sapien was the only human hominid around. And we can attribute that to better technology, which allowed them to more effectively hunt prey, and also allowed them probably to more effectively fight with other archaic human groups. Holocene period, also known as the Neolithic period, New Stone Age, is when agriculture really took off, farming and the domestication of animals started to happen, and these experiments happened everywhere. So all of humankind in every location is practicing their farming and going through some form of agricultural revolution till about 2000 BC. So the pattern that most civilizations are going to take, and this is true from China to the Indus River Valley to Egypt to Sumeria, is you're going to have these hunting-gathering communities that kind of transition slowly into a combination of hunting and gathering and domestication of grains that switches into a settled agrarian community, which then allows for a specialization of skills because there's enough food for everybody so they can do other stuff. And that specialization of skill led to wealth because they were able to trade the things they made with other people. When you have a lot of good stuff, then that means that other people might want to try and take it from you. So you have to start doing things like building walls and centralizing your state so that you can protect your stuff more effectively. And you build bigger cities with those walls, and suddenly you have an urban environment. This seems to be the pattern that most civilizations go through, that they pretty much have to go through in order to get to civilization by our modern definition of that word. Where that starts for the Harappan, as far as we have a record for, is about 7,000 BC in a village called Mehikra. It is in modern-day Pakistan, though the area is under some contesting stuff right now with Afghanistan and Iran also, but nominally it is under Pakistani control. Mehikra is going to become one of the largest agrarian settled communities in between the Indus River Valley and the Mediterranean Sea. So it's big and it's important. The Mehikra site shows evidence of cultivation of both wheat and barley between 7,000 and 2,600 BC, increased consumption and domestication of animals. The site was abandoned in 2,600, which is actually very typical of the Harappan civilization. They abandoned a lot of their unplanned sites and then built planned cities, and then that's where they would live. There are evidence of planned homes, though, and kind of a standardized 1-room, 2-room, 3-room, 4-room housing plan at Mehikra. And the larger buildings we believe were used as granaries. They farmed barley more significantly than wheat, and were well on their way to fully domesticating the crop. Grave goods included ornaments made out of seashells, lapis, turquoise, and other precious stones. Mexicra is not near the sea, and so the presence of seashells means that they had enough of an extensive trade network that they were somehow able to get seashells. Very cool. Dating around 6000 BC, archaeologists have found imprints of cotton thread. This area, this region, is the first place where cotton was domesticated. It was figured out how to turn it into thread and then woven into cloth. A huge step for human civilization all over. Graves also revealed 11 individuals with drilled teeth, which means that the first dentist may well have come from the Indus River Valley. The reason why the sudden need for dental care is because grains are not great for the teeth. So the transition from hunting and gathering into Neolithic meant more grains, which was bad news for teeth everywhere. The ceramic period began at about 6000 BC, but there is not evidence of a wheel until closer to 3000 BC. So the way that would work is that you would be assembling pottery together by hand, which means there's going to be a lot of variation in how it looks. It's not going to look as standardized as with a wheel spun pot. So over a 5,000-year period, Mexicra is going to grow from a small settlement experimenting with farming and then rapidly expand. From DNA standpoint, we can be fairly certain that these people would grow into the Harappan civilization, and they were not steppe peoples. For a while, there was kind of this contention that maybe the Aryans, who were going to come in later, were the Harappans, and that this was an early civilization of them. But from what we can tell, that's a completely separate group of people. The Aryans would have come in at around 1900 BC, and they did not have urban societies. They did not have a written script, and they were horse people. There's no evidence of horses in the Harappan civilization. So we can be pretty certain that this is a pre-steppe invasion group of people. The people who, though, were genetically connected are going to be some, and this is where it gets confusing to say it, they are not Iranians because Iran does not exist, but they were pastoral, pre-agrarian, Iranian Zagros Mountains peoples, and they migrated out of the Zagros Mountains into this plain. They genetically mixed with the first Indians, and so this kind of becomes a genetic component to the Harappan civilization. They're a mix of first Indians and Zagros Mountain pastorals, pre-agrarian, though they did not bring agriculture to the Indus River Valley. They may have brought partially domesticated goats, but they descended down from the mountains, bringing their language, which is going to be kind of a Proto-Dravidian language, and they bring, or Proto-Elamite, I should say, which might turn into a Proto-Dravidian language. They come down, they mix with the people, and then some of them probably keep going pastorally down into southern India, where they just continue on with their goats, spreading their language into southern India. And this becomes important with the fall of the Harappans, that there were already perhaps some people speaking a Proto-Elamite language or Proto-Dravidian language in southern India. Not all agrarian societies become civilizations, but all civilizations have to go through this agricultural period in order to become a civilization. What usually comes hand in hand with specialization of skills is some kind of hierarchy or some kind of theology. But as we cannot read the Harappan script, we really don't know what their hierarchy looked like or their religious practices. We can only make guesses, educated guesses though they may be. The clues can come from seal designs and architecture and sculptures that are left behind, and archaeologists and historians have had to analyze this complex society kind of in this prehistoric manner. At its peak, it may have covered almost 1 million square kilometers, and it was the largest population of any kind of contemporary civilization. So it's bigger than Egypt by a lot, it's bigger than Sumeria by a lot, and it is bigger than the Shang by a little less. The Shang were also big, but they're a little later, they're 1500 in China. If we're really talking about this 2600 to 1900 BC timeline, the 700-year period, they're the biggest and they have the largest concentration of any population group. It's very impressive at its peak. So now let's talk about it. Let's talk about what the mature Harappan civilization looks like. During the early Harappan period, there was still a certain amount of difference between pottery styles that's very observable. What changed. And this was over the course of probably about 5 generations or 100 to 150 years, is that everything, specifically with pottery, got really standardized really fast. And with that standardization came the abandonment of lots of old settlements and the building of lots of new cities that were on this planned city grid-like methodology. So around 2300 BC, we're going to have Harappan artifacts that are going to show the standardized bricks and pots, the regular streets, and then production of decorative artifacts. And that includes beads and shell work. Again, they're not very near the ocean, which means that they have a pretty extensive trade network in place. They had bronze, they had hardware and seals, which with their script, the elusive script that we can't read, that's where it is written. They invented wheeled transportation, including the ox cart, which they were very proud of. You can tell this from their artwork. Groups formed not a federation, but a single civilization. And we are probably dealing with what we should consider an empire, judging by the territory that they seem to have control over. We think that it was probably controlled by a powerful and elite group, and that it was controlled cohesively. So we're not talking about city-states. So Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro did not fight each other the way that, say, Lagash and Uruk would have in Mesopotamia. So it's not city-states with kings in each city-state, and it's not one powerful god king like we would see in Egypt. It instead looks like in more of an oligarchic elite. So they don't have any temples, and they don't have any structure that we can identify as a temple. That does not mean that there were not temples. It just means that we can't identify something that we think looks like a temple. There were no palaces. That doesn't mean that there weren't elites, though. There are clear houses that, while they followed kind of a standard look, they were just a little bit bigger. So that implies that there were people with more means who were more powerful, potentially. Maybe they were kings, maybe they were elites, maybe it was this oligarchic ruling class, we don't really know, but not what we would consider to be a palace. So, we can see palatial structures in China, we can see them very clearly in Mesopotamia, we can see them very clearly in Egypt. They were not in Indus River Valley. There is something that we call the priest-king sculpture from Mohenjo-Daro, but we don't really know that he was a priest. We don't really know that he was a king. He just probably was an elite person. And this sculpture also is very, very small. So they didn't build these enormous sculptural art designs that you might be thinking of. They're tiny. Also a thing that there weren't a lot of elaborate funerals. So the grave goods that we have are pretty limited because people just weren't buried with that much. There were ceramics buried with food, which would be presumably what they would need in the next life. But we're not talking about fancy jewelry. We're not talking about tools. We're not talking about anything like the grave goods that we're going to see with, I guess with China, the Han is when it really, really picks up. But even before the Han, there were extensive grave goods that told us quite a bit about how they lived. And obviously in Mesopotamia and in Egypt, grave goods are a huge part of the archaeological record that we have. Not so in Harappa. With the Harappans, instead, it seems like they chose to pass on their goods instead of keeping them in the grave, which, power to them, that's much better, actually. It means that they were conscious of not wasting resources, and then when something wore out, they probably recycled it into something new instead of, just throwing it away. So it does feel like there's a real dearth of artifacts, but really telling, in a way, about the Harappan civilization because it means that they weren't wasteful and they were very mindful of what resources they had. Also, what there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence of in their art, there's not a lot of human-on-human depictions of violence. There is some stuff for human-on-animal, but human-on-human, it's not there. And none of their cities over that 700-year period that we're talking about show any evidence of ever being attacked or burned. What does this mean? Is this really a society without war? That seems wild to me, but it does appear that they did not often fight war, and their tools that they have kind of attest to this also. So we have spears, we have knives, we have the bow, but these are not necessarily ideal for going and fighting a major war. They're ideal for killing animals, for food. So what did the Harappans have? They had large, well-planned out cities that were neatly laid out with good streets and good residences. They did not always have fortified walls. Instead, sometimes they had these systems of reservoirs instead. So they were very interested in properly storing water. They were the largest reservoirs of their kind at the time. We have evidence of some 700 wells. We have evidence of the Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro. And there is just an abundance of homes with toilets that were connected to sewage drains that were under the street and took sewage somewhere else, not in the city. So the Harappans gave very unique attention to water and to cleanliness and to sanitization. In the city of Harappa, archaeologists have uncovered toilets in pretty much every home. Known for their obsession with standardization, the brick is the most important part of these standards. It had a 1:4 ratio. The largest structures in Mohenjo-Daro were granaries, and also the city had a large bath. It might have been used for some sort of religious purpose, or it might have been a public bath. It might be kind of like Roman baths, where it was just something for the elite to use. It might have been used for religious purposes. Who's to say? It's really cool they had it. And if there was an easy to do business with society, culture of the ancient world, right there along with Egypt would be the Harappan civilization because of their standardized weights and measurements. So an amount that you would ask for in one side of the civilization to the other would be the same. Standardized weighing and measurement systems are the backbone of good international trade. And that trade took place externally within the Persian Gulf. The Mesopotamians may have referred to them as Meluha, but also they may have referred to maybe civilizations in Africa as Meluha. But what the Mesopotamians, we do believe, traded were bronze and tin, silver, and precious stones that were not found within easy reach of the Indus River Valley. And what the Mesopotamians got back was copper for bronze making, gold, timber, ivory, and cotton textiles. And I always find it really interesting that there was an exchange of copper and tin between the Harappans and Mesopotamia, because neither one of them would have been very successful in creating bronze without the ingredients. So they were able to get as far as they got in their Bronze Age because of their globalized trade. And then also another thing that got traded was sesame, a plant from Southeast Asia origin that thrived really well in Sumeria. Harappan seals have been found in Mesopotamia with some evidence of Harappan transliteration. This might end up being a key to breaking the language. So we think that they might have used the script and transliterated either Sumerian or Akkadian onto the seals. We can't read it, but it appears, the letters appear in a different kind of pattern than they do when they're at home in India. There are 5 seals from Mohenjo-Daro and 6 molded tablets from Harappa that show similar themes as the Epic of Gilgamesh, which means that they've got a hero figure that's holding like 2 tigers by the throat. In Mesopotamia, that would have been the lions. So whether this is an exchange of the story that occurred through trade, which is probably my vote, or something that the Iranian Zagros Mountain pastorals brought with them when they moved, we don't really know. I would probably vote that it has something to do with just an exchange of the story through trade. We have no clear picture of the religious practices of the Harappans. There is indication of a shared ideological belief system. So some sort of mythology may be associated with a unicorn. This is judging based on the art of the seals. So 1/5 of those discovered have had an animal that appears to be a unicorn on it. The seals depict scenes we assume that are evocative of religious beliefs or well-known myths or legends. The Harappan script first appears around 3,300 BC, which is right on time for China, Mesopotamia, and Egypt. That's when writing developed in all of these places. When thinking of how to break open this script into something that people can read, a problem that we're running into is that there's no Rosetta Stone. So what the Rosetta Stone had for Egyptian hieroglyphs is there was Demotic, there were hieroglyphs, and there was a Greek script that were all saying the same thing. We were able to read the Greek, and then with the help of Coptic Egyptian, which is kind of a leftover language of ancient Egyptian, the rest was able to be cracked in the 1800s. And then we were able to read hieroglyphs. Something sort of similar was around for cuneiform, the Behestum inscription, which had Akkadian, Old Persian, and Elamite on it. And that led to the being able to read cuneiform script. So far, there hasn't been anything similar with the Harappan script, which is something that has a known like Proto-Elamite or Dravidian language that also has the Indus River Valley script on it. And until such a thing happens, it might be kind of difficult, or linguists are just going to have to figure out a way to break it using linguistic patterns, which is sort of the method that they're going with. There's a certain amount of evidence that they spoke a Proto-Dravidian. Currently in South India, there are about 6 languages that can be connected to that. The people who moved into the region from the Zagros Mountains spoke a Proto-Elamite. When the Harappans fell, it appears that they moved south, and what they brought with them was their language, which was the Proto-Dravidian language. 250 million people in India now speak some form of that Dravidian language family. So what linguists are having to do is analyze Dravidian and Elamite and see if they can find some way within those languages to work out what the script of the Harappans is trying to say. Until the script is broken, all conclusions, all that we can say about the Harappan civilization is kind of under question, because we can make our best guesses using archaeology, using genetics, using linguistic methods. But until we can actually read what they had to say about themselves, their own records, it's very well put together, educated guesses. And we just won't know until then. Important elements that make up India's population today were already in place by the time the Harappans fell in 1900 BC. So we have the first Indians, we have those Iranian Zagros mountain farmers. The piece of the puzzle that we are missing are those steppe people, the Aryans. The Aryans brought with them their Vedas, orally spoken because they did not have a written language yet, and their religion and their caste systems. But there's some debate about whether the Aryans militarily infiltrated what was the Harappan civilization, or if they were simply filling a vacuum where there wasn't a lot of resistance there because the civilization had already fallen. So around 1900, Mohenjo-Daro was gradually abandoned. No one knows why. Possibly because of floods and salinization of the soil. The Harappans were planting probably quite a bit, and like any area that used to be part of the sea, which was underwater, once you start planting over generations and generations, you can have a salinization problem because there's no way to get rid of all that leftover salt. Wheat does really poorly in salinized soil. Barley will try and hold on. And then also, despite there being floods potentially in the record, there's also potentially a drought. And we can tell that because the Gagar River ends up drying up. So this appears to be an area of extreme drought, of extreme salinization. So what do all of these people do? There is a dispersal and dilution of Harappan pottery styles at this time, a disappearance of the hallmark of Harappan civilizations. So that's the obsessive standardization of everything. Craft skills and agricultural expertise did survive. Spinning and weaving cotton is something that survived, which thank goodness, because Indian cotton is one of the great contributions to the world. Between 2000 and 1500 BC, we're going to have waves of steppe pastorals who migrate from Central Asia, bringing with them the Indo-European language, Sanskrit, and the new religious practice derived from the Vedas, which would eventually be written down in 1200 BC, the first one being the Rig Veda. That was going to become those 4 religious texts, the backbone of Hinduism. The 1,000 years after the Harappan civilization was probably a period of tumult and turbulation. A long-standing civilization, the largest of its kind at the time, fell apart. People migrated to the east and to the south. Those steppe migrations from the northwest brought new languages and a different culture and put an emphasis on sacrificial ritual and like a cattle-based religion. Their pastoralism and cattle breeding was something that civilization, that group of people preferred over urban development, and so urban development sort of went on the wayside. The next wave of migrants that came from the northeast, so these are going to be kind of more of our Tibetan and Chinese influences. They also brought new languages, domesticated plants and animals and wetland farming techniques and rice. But that doesn't mean that the Harappan civilization didn't very quietly influence Indian history up into today. The Harappans didn't just die or disappear. They did what every people group does when times get tough. They migrated. In doing so, perhaps their language has survived with several mutations, just like a genetic code mutates over time, into the Dravidian languages that we know. So when we hear Tamil, are we in fact hearing an echo of the past of that great Harappan civilization? And maybe in the not too distant future, linguists will finally be able to crack the code and bring the Harappan civilization into the true historic period, allowing us to read their script and know who they said they were. Our next ancient civilization that we will be covering will be the ancient Peruvians, and specifically Norte Chico civilization. There will probably be 2 videos in between now and then because I really want to give them their due when it comes to research and be sure I'm presenting that information as accurately as I can. Like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to my channel for more history content, and leave me a comment to let me know what ancient civilization you would like to time travel back to. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye!